My sister claimed I was a danger to my own kids, so I made sure she lost custody of hers. I'm a 34-year-old single father, raising two wonderful children, my 8-year-old son and my 5-year-old daughter. Life hasn't always been easy, but I've worked hard to create a stable and happy home for the three of us. My sister, Gabriella, is 37, she's married to Rodrigo, and they have two kids, a 10-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl. On the surface, Gabriella's life looks picture perfect, a well-paying corporate job, a spacious house in the suburbs, and a husband who seems to have everything under control. But trust me, appearances can be deceiving. Gabriella and I were never close growing up. She was the so-called golden child, the one who followed every rule, earned perfect grades, and always made our parents proud. I, on the other hand, was the difficult one, the kid who asked too many questions, challenged authority, made mistakes, and according to my parents, gave them gray hair. Gabriella always enjoyed reminding me of her achievements. Even as kids, she'd leave her test papers out where I could see them, as if to show me how easy it was for her to be perfect. As adults, not much changed between us. Gabriella developed a habit of disguising her criticism as helpful advice. When I chose to become a freelance graphic designer, she dismissed it as a hobby job and questioned whether I was setting the right example for my children. When my son chose dance over soccer, she acted as though I was dooming him to a lifetime of teasing. And when she found out my daughter's favorite color was black instead of pink, she even joked half seriously about whether I was saving up for therapy. That's just the way Gabriella is. The real turning point came during our last family gathering, a backyard barbecue at our parents' house. It was one of those rare occasions when everyone actually showed up. My kids were running around with their cousins, laughing and having fun, but of course, Gabriella couldn't resist making a loud comment for everyone to hear. She said something about how I let my kids run wild, and how it was no surprise they never listened to anyone. I laughed it off at the time, mostly because I've learned not to let her words get under my skin, but I couldn't help but notice Rodrigo giving me that judgmental side glance, probably comparing my parenting style to their strict schedules, color-coded chore charts, and limited screen time. Gabriella and Rodrigo are the textbook definition of helicopter parents. Their kids aren't allowed to eat sweets, stay up past 7:30 p.m., or watch anything that isn't education. Rodrigo loves posting Pinterest-perfect photos of family game nights and homemade science projects. But their kids always look exhausted, like they're growing up inside a pressure cooker. Meanwhile, Gabriella treats motherhood like a side project. She works long hours, and at family events, she usually spends her time scrolling on her phone, only pausing to give orders or criticize someone else. About a week after that barbecue, my mom called me, clearly uncomfortable. She told me she'd heard from some extended family members that Gabriella had been spreading some pretty nasty rumors about me. Apparently, Gabriella had been telling people that I was an unfit parent because I was too lenient, and that my so-called unstable lifestyle would harm my kids in the long run. She even hinted that someone should contact Child Protective Services before it was too late. I was completely stunned. It's one thing to criticize me to my face, but going behind my back and saying things like that, even involving Child Protective Services, was a whole new level of betrayal. A few days later, my worst fear became reality. There was a knock at the door, and standing there were two CPS workers. They explained that they had received an anonymous report, claiming my home was unsafe and that there were concerns about neglect. My heart was racing, but I let them. They were polite but very thorough, asking about everything from my kids' meals to their sleeping arrangements. They even spoke directly with my son and daughter, who, bless them, were a little confused but completely cooperative. After about an hour, the CPS workers told me everything seemed fine and that they would be closing the case. Still, the entire experience left me deeply unsettled. At the next family gathering, I decided to talk to Gabrielle. I didn't accuse her directly, but I calmly asked if she knew anything about the CPS report. She gave me a smug little smile and said something along the lines of, "People just want what's best for the kids. Sometimes it takes an outsider to see the bigger picture." It took everything I had not to lose my temper. When my parents found out what had happened, they were furious, but still, they refused to cut ties with Gabriella. They believed it was important to keep the family together, no matter what. Rodrigo, of course, stood by her side, claiming that everything they did came from a place of love, because according to him, I was too selfish to put my kids first. That was the moment I realized I couldn't trust either of them anymore. From then on, I started keeping track of everything, every passive-aggressive comment, every questionable moment I noticed about their own parenting during family gathering. I also began paying closer attention to their kids, who as time went on seemed more withdrawn and distant every time I saw them. I didn't know exactly where this would lead, but one thing was clear: I wasn't going to let Gabriella and Rodrigo get away with this. Not long after the CPS visit, things started to unravel. One evening, as I was going through my messages, I got a notification from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. It was an old friend of Rodrigo's, someone who used to be close to him before he married Gabriella, but had gradually drifted away. That's when everything started to fall into place in ways I never could have predicted. At first, the message seemed harmless, just casual catching up. But as the conversation went on, I began to sense that something was about to change. Rodrigo's old friend hinted that, back when they were close, he had known things about Rodrigo, things I probably deserved to hear. He said I would probably find what he knew interesting. I didn't even have to push too hard for him to open up. Apparently, Rodrigo had some skeletons in his closet. Early in his marriage to Gabriella, he had an affair with one of her co-workers. Although the affair was short-lived, it caused a quiet scandal within Rodrigo's social circle, which was probably the reason why he cut ties with this friend. Gabriella knew about the affair but chose to brush it under the rug, all to maintain the appearance of being the perfect couple. It seemed like Gabriella believed their professional success and flawless social media image were more important than actually dealing with the real issues in their marriage. This information felt like a key to me. It wasn't just about the affair, but about how far they were willing to manipulate the narrative in order to look perfect. I knew I couldn't use this information against them directly, but it gave me a completely new perspective. I started watching Gabriella and Rodrigo more carefully, the way Rodrigo interacted with other women, the way he smiled at female staff during family events, even the comments he made when he thought no one was listening. Slowly the masks they wore started to slip, at least in my eyes, and I was determined to use that. Meanwhile, I kept documenting everything I saw during family gatherings. I sat down with their kids, trying to understand what was really going on inside their home. The children seemed tired and cautious, almost like they were walking on eggshells. It didn't take long for the eldest boy to let something slip. He quietly said, "Dad always yells when we mess up and Mom never has time to play with me." Those words stuck in my mind like they were carved in stone. I knew something wasn't right, but I also knew I needed more than just a feeling. It was during a Christmas dinner that things really started to fall apart for them. As usual, Gabriella spent most of the evening glued to her phone, barely acknowledging her children, while Rodrigo looked visibly tense as he struggled to manage the situation. The kids were clearly starved for attention, and eventually started crying, hoping someone would notice them. I stayed silent, just observing everything. At one point, the eldest boy accidentally knocked over a glass of juice, and Rodrigo completely lost his temper. He shouted so loudly that the entire room went quiet. The little girl burst into tears, and Gabriella, instead of comforting her, simply gave the scene a cold, disapproving look, as if the whole thing was nothing more than an inconvenience. That was the breaking point for me. I didn't say anything in the moment, but it strengthened my resolve. I couldn't help but think, if this had been my family, CPS would have been knocking on my door again without a second thought. So why should it be any different for them? I decided to take action. Armed with everything I had documented, and the conversations I'd had with their children, I reached out to a lawyer friend. I explained the entire situation, and he guided me through the proper steps. I filed a detailed report, describing the suffocating environment those kids were growing up in. It wasn't an easy decision to make. A part of me knew this would create a deep divide within the family, but the other part, the part that still remembered the sleepless nights after my own visit from CPS, knew it was the right thing to do. It didn't take long for the consequences to start unfolding. A few weeks later, while I was dropping my kids off at school, I got a message from my mother. Gabriella was in a complete panic. CPS agents had started investigating their home. Whether it was irony or poetic justice, it felt like their carefully constructed world was finally beginning to collapse. And the agents ended up uncovering far more than anyone expected. I sat down with their children, trying to understand what was happening inside their home. The kids looked tired and cautious, almost as if they were walking on eggshells. It didn't take long for the eldest boy to slip up. He casually mentioned, "Dad always yells when I mess up, and Mom never has time to play with me." Those words were burned into my memory. I knew something wasn't right, but I needed more than just a feeling. It was during a Christmas dinner that things started to unravel for them. As usual, Gabriella spent most of the time on her phone, ignoring her kids, while Rodrigo appeared visibly frustrated, trying to control the situation. The kids, desperate for attention, began crying. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, observing everything unfold. When the boy accidentally knocked over a glass of juice, Rodrigo lost his temper. He shouted so loudly that the entire room fell silent. The little girl immediately started crying, and instead of comforting her, Gabriella simply shot her a disapproving look, as if the whole scene was nothing more than an inconvenience to her. That was the tipping point for me. I didn't speak up in the moment, but it strengthened my resolve. I thought to myself, if this were my family, CPS would have been called again, so why shouldn't it be the same for them? I decided to take action. Using everything I had documented, and the conversations I had with their children, I reached out to a lawyer. I explained the situation, and he helped guide me on how to proceed. I filed a detailed report describing the stifling, unhealthy environment in which those kids were being raised. It wasn't an easy decision. Part of me knew it would create a huge rift in the family, but the other part, the part that still remembered the sleepless nights after my own CPS visit, knew it was the right thing to do. It didn't take long for the consequences to unfold. A few weeks later, while I was dropping my kids off at school, I received a message from my mother. Gabriella was in complete panic. CPS agents were investigating their home. Whether it was irony or poetic justice, it felt like their world was finally starting to crumble, and the agents uncovered far more than anyone had anticipated. I could have never imagined that it wasn't just the emotional pressure Rodrigo and Gabriella put on their kids, but also the strange living conditions they were forced to endure. While the house looked pristine for visitors and photos, the children revealed that they spent most of their time in complete silence, terrified of upsetting their parents. The strict rules and constant yelling were stifling. Rodrigo was called in for questioning, and Gabriella had to face the consequences of her emotional neglect for the first time. When the news spread through the family, Gabriella and Rodrigo's perfect image was shattered. My mother tried to mediate the situation, but I was beyond reconciliation. Gabriella tried to confront me, accusing me of destroying her family, but this time I didn't hold back. I told her everything. I thought that she had no right to judge me as a parent when her own household was falling apart. I reminded her how she used the facade of perfection to hide her flaws, and most importantly, how I would never forgive her for involving CPS against me without any valid reasons. The following months were difficult for Gabriella and Rodrigo. The CPS investigation revealed that while there was no physical abuse, the emotional environment was harmful to the children. They were required to attend family therapy and were monitored by social workers. The kids began spending more time with our parents, which ironically helped them open up more. I kept focusing on my own children, determined to give them the home they deserved, but with the satisfaction of knowing that, this time, justice had been served. As for Gabriella, she never regained the image she valued so much. Her marriage to Rodrigo began to fall apart, and the criticisms she once directed at me were now aimed at him. It was like watching a house of cards built on lies crumble. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe in peace. What followed was a slow but inevitable downward spiral for Gabriella and Rodrigo. The CPS investigation forced them into supervised therapy sessions. However, what should have been an opportunity for them to rebuild became the beginning of the end. Gabriella struggled with the constant scrutiny, and Rodrigo couldn't handle losing control of the narrative they had worked so hard to maintain. Their marriage started to deteriorate irreparably, but unlike what Gabriella might have expected. I wasn't concerned with their personal issues. For me, the children were what truly mattered. Although they were still in their parents' care, I knew their living environment had shifted. Social workers began making regular visits, and Gabriella and Rodrigo's behavior was under close supervision. They could no longer hide what was really going on. A few months later, during a family gathering, my mother tried to convince me to make peace with Gabriella. According to her, the family needed to remain united. Sensing an opportunity to become the center of attention, Gabriella seized the moment to try and shift the narrative again. With a calculated smile, she said, "If you had spent more time improving your own life instead of trying to ruin mine, maybe you wouldn't have wasted so much time." I didn't hold back. "Ruin your life, Gabriella? You did that yourself. You chose to prioritize your image over your children. You decided it was more important to appear perfect than to actually be a good mother. And instead of owning up to your mistakes, you attacked me. You threw stones at my house without realizing yours was made of glass. She tried to argue, but for the first time the people around us weren't siding with her. Rodrigo, who usually stayed quiet in these situations, looked visibly uncomfortable. It was clear that the truth couldn't be hidden any longer, and everyone knew. Gabriella raised her voice, but my mother, who had always been lenient with her, interrupted. Enough, Gabriella, you need to stop blaming others for the consequences of your choices. That was a moment of shock. My mother, who had always tried to keep the peace, finally acknowledged what everyone had already known. Gabriella wasn't a victim of anything, except her own actions. A few months later, the news began to spread. Gabriella and Rodrigo's marriage officially came to an end. During their divorce proceedings, details that had only been whispered among family members started to surface. Rodrigo attempted to use Gabriella's shortcomings against her to gain an advantage in the division of assets, while Gabriella did the same to him. Both were willing to play dirty, but in the end, there wasn't much left for either of them. The house was sold to settle debts, and the children went to live with my parents while their parents tried to rebuild their lives. As for me, I was in a better place than ever. My children thrived in a home filled with love and freedom. I had managed to expand my work as a graphic designer, and was finally in a comfortable position, both financially and emotionally. It hadn't been easy to get there, but every step was a reminder that I had done what was right. Gabriella tried to reach out to me a few times with vague messages, usually disguised as apologies, but they were never truly sincere. I ignored them. Surprisingly, Rodrigo did the same. Perhaps he realized too late that Gabriella had never been as perfect as he once believed. A few years later, I saw Gabriella and Rodrigo's kids again at a family reunion organized by my mother. They seemed happier and more relaxed. They even shyly thanked me for everything I had done. That's when I realized that despite all the chaos, what truly mattered was that they were okay. Somehow I had managed to protect not only my own kids, but also theirs. As I watched them playing in the backyard with my children, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. Gabriella and Rodrigo had destroyed themselves, but the impact of their choices wouldn't last forever. The children still had a chance at something better. In the end, it wasn't about revenge or hatred. It was a fight for the truth, for what was right. I lost a lot in the process, but I also gained something invaluable, the certainty that I did everything I could. I could protect those who needed it, and for me, that was enough. I didn't need accolades or recognition for what I did. The true reward came from seeing the children happy, seeing them grow up in a stable and loving environment, something they deserved after everything they had been through. Life had a way of throwing challenges at us, but I had learned to navigate through them with patience and resilience, and in doing so, I found peace. Over time, the distance between me and Gabriella and Rodrigo grew wider. I stopped feeling the weight of their choices on my shoulders. Their struggles became theirs to handle, and I realized I had to let go of the bitterness that had once consumed me. It wasn't easy. There were days when I still found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, but I had learned to focus on what I could control, my actions, my relationships, and the future I was building with my children. It became clear to me that healing was not just a personal journey. It was something we all had to go through. The kids, despite their parents' failures, were able to heal and find joy in their lives. They were resilient, and through their eyes, I began to see that no matter how broken the past might have been, there was always hope for a better tomorrow. The love I gave to my children was returned 1,000-fold. They had become my strength, my purpose, and the reason I pushed forward Watching them grow, I knew I was doing something right. Their laughter, their curiosity, their endless energy, all reminded me of the beauty of life, even when it seemed like everything was falling apart. As for Gabriella and Rodrigo, I heard little of them over the years. I'm sure they continued their lives, each struggling in their own way. Life had a way of catching up to people, no matter how hard they tried to escape it, but I no longer felt anger toward them. I realized that holding on to anger was just another way to give them power over my life, and I was done with that. Instead, I focused on the future. There were new opportunities ahead, new people to meet, and new experiences to cherish. The past had shaped me, yes, but it didn't define who I was or where I was going. I had learned to move on, to let go of the things that no longer served me, and to embrace what was coming next. My life, and the lives of my children, were full of possibilities, and as I looked at them, I knew they were going to be okay.
That was all that truly mattered. In the end, it wasn't the past that mattered, but the future we could build together. Every day was a chance to create something better, something brighter, and I wasn't going to wait.